So here's one of the land speeders from my own personal 40k collection, painted up with a bit of freehand and weathering a little bit before the whole Primaris range was released. Looks like the rules for this, and no doubt a whole bunch of other people's, are going to be going to Warhammer Legends. I thought it would be worth dedicating a video to talk about the fallout of all this, perhaps the consequences for miniatures besides the ones that they have just directly removed. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're circling back to cover the whole situation with the Firstborn model range once more, and perhaps particularly focus on what it could mean for other kits besides the ones that have just been directly pulled, and whether this is really going to make a whole load of people question whether or not they should pick up any more Firstborn models, even if Games Workshop has just removed a chunk of the range and there's plenty still there. As we talked about earlier in the week, Games Workshop basically announced a whole bunch of classic Space Marine units going out of production recently. And I'd say since the advent of the Primaris and the first few steps at phasing out the Firstborn, this is by far the biggest and most drastic step that they've taken. We've seen a few units be fully updated, and we've had a bunch of peripheral characters being removed from the web store. But this is really kicking things into a massive extra level. Lots of units that a bunch of Space Marine players are going to have in their collections from years back, having their models taken down from the Games Workshop web store, their rules going into Legends really quite quickly. And while it was perhaps expected that this might happen at some point, it still happened rather suddenly and without much warning within the context of 10th edition, just after they'd had a bunch of rules released for them. One of three things will happen to them: either they'll have their models updated with new Primaris equivalents, which might happen to a couple. Games Workshop will recommend that you proxy them as a different miniature, perhaps such as the Bikers and Outriders, and most of the rest will get Legends datasheets, where you get a final profile for the unit and a final points cost, and then Games Workshop kind of washes their hands of it, no longer to be thought about with codex updates or balance updates, and not recommended for things like tournaments, even if you can still play with them casually. The list of the losses is fairly big within the Space Marine range, even if they do have an enormous range to start with. They've got the Scout Squad, Scout Bikers and Landspeeder Storm, the Assault Squad, the Landspeeder, Bikers and Attack Bikes, the Hunter and Stalker anti-air tanks, Ironclad Dreadnought and Thunderfire Cannon, and most of the last remaining Firstborn characters, including a Librarian, a Tech Marine and the Command Squad. Before we get into the units removed specifically, certainly one of the major talking points that a lot of people have had is that the Space Marine range is just very bloated and this was going to happen at some stage. I think that is objectively just completely true. There are 120 plus datasheets in their index alone, which is kind of ridiculous, though quite a few of those are just minor variants on characters. The range has become very bloated like this because rather than just updating units like for like, such as what they did with, say, replacing Eldar Howling Banshees from their older resin kit a few years back, for the most part the Primaris Space Marines have tended to add just completely new units to the range, things that fit in pretty well with the rest of the Space Marine line, but tend to be armed with different combinations of weapons or war gear, or have a different overall feel to the model that came before. It's certainly often looked at with annoyance with factions with less choice or less support, and realistically Games Workshop probably just weren't going to keep on releasing more and more kits forever. There was almost certainly going to be a bit of a reckoning at some stage, and some kits would gradually be removed. All that being said though, it doesn't really make it any less painful for people who might have modelled up and painted these units, perhaps from before the whole Primaris range thing, perhaps from after, as Games Workshop haven't really publicly said that there's any major plan to just get rid of the entire Firstborn range, even if most people suspect that that's generally going to be their eventual endgame. Regardless of how well supported your faction's range might be, it doesn't really help anyone who's got units they might really like, and then just have their rules mothballed and no longer really supported in a meaningful way. I think there was a general sense that things like this would happen at some point, though until the actual announcement I think that there was at least every chance that it could have still been years away, though every rules update is a risk, and it seems like the reckoning has come at the time of the Space Marine Codex in 10th for at least a lot of their range. I think this just might have been a bit of a shock for some people, as I just don't really think they've managed people's expectations very well in recent months, and a lot of their rhetoric has generally been that for the most part Space Marine Firstborn models are going to be supported. That was something that came up in a few questions at that Warhammer Fest Q&A a few months back. They said that they weren't planning on doing any mass removal of Firstborn units, even if some kits will gradually be phased out. They'd apparently be pragmatically focusing on sales of kits in particular, either very old kits that don't look quite as good in the range, or lower selling kits going first, so it's perhaps not surprising that a bunch of the slightly more peripheral tech for the Space Marines has gone away, and a few things that you could argue they've basically made a sort of replacement for things like Outriders for bikes and Invader ATVs for attack bikes. They definitely weren't too shy about saying that some things would gradually be going away, but from the language they were using around that sort of announcement it did sound like it would be at really quite a small scale, without entire swaths of the fast attack section getting cold for example. Then there's the 10th edition data cards, which I think maybe reinforced people's expectations that the units will be supportive for this edition at least. Though it seems they've perhaps been a little bit haphazard with this, there have been plenty of units that have just gone away and are no longer present on the data cards. But most of the Space Marine Firstborn range was absolutely fine, including some niche characters that they didn't sell anymore. I think people were kind of expecting that they might not make it into the Space Marine Codex, but perhaps not expecting things like attack bikes, land speeders, ironclad dreadnoughts, or hunters and stalkers to go away in the few months interim. I think it's perhaps maybe particularly painful that a bunch of people will have definitely bought these kits since the 10th rule set came out, brand new shiny rules for the miniatures that might push you into different ways of playing your army. Perhaps Assault Marines could be a fairly popular one. Big argument for them over Vanguard veterans these days, so there might have been something that a few players picked up. Within these models, I'd say there's basically two types of model replacement that they've done. Ones that are pretty much directly replaced by a Primaris direct equivalent, things like the Stern Guard or Terminators have from Leviathan. I guess you could argue that the Outriders and the Bikers are at least somewhat close, though the scale is very different, and the same for attack bikes and Invader ATVs. And I'd hope that this might well be the case for the Scouts and the Assault Marines, which will definitely make the phase out of those feel a lot less bad if it does turn out to be the case. I think it maybe makes things a bit uncertain at the moment. We know Space Marines are going to be getting a whole bunch of kits when their Codex comes out. Probably at least a few of them will be updates for these. I would guess the Scouts and Assault Marines will get updates, but we don't actually know at this point. They might either be coming later or not at all. There are plenty of things though that I think have a pretty good chance of getting absolutely no direct replacements. Land Speeders, for example, are very different from their Primaris equivalent, the Storm Speeder, and the Hunter Stalkers, Ironclad Dreadnoughts, and Thunderfire Cannons don't really have a direct replacement. I'd guess they get some Legend datasheets, but I think there's little to no chance of Games Workshop making new Primaris models that are basically the same thing as those. Just going through the models individually quickly, the Landspeeder, as I mentioned from the start, is perhaps one of the most problematic ones to most people, a very common model that people have had over the years, maybe particularly for armies like Dark Angels, Raven Wing, and White Scars. One of these happened to be my first 40k vehicle miniature I ever painted from the 3rd edition starter set. I guess perhaps for contemporary Space Marine rules it might be actually closest to the Invader ATV in terms of size and armament. Feels like they'd just be hard to proxy as a Storm Speeder as they're significantly smaller, and maybe just don't make quite so much sense for the defensive profile and would be far easier to hide. For the bikes, Games Workshop hinted that you might be able to run them as Outriders. The special weapons and sergeant gear won't translate very well. I think they look kind of small for the enormous Outrider bases. Probably more doable than most though, and they could translate across. The Assault Squad could be run as Vanguard veterans, though as mentioned I hope they release some Jump Assault Primaris at some point. It does seem like an obvious gap that they need to fill at some stage. For the Scout units, I think that there's a good chance that they release some Primaris Scouts that are similar to the Black Templar Neophytes. I'd be very surprised if they come out with analogous things for the Storm Speeder or the Scout Bikers though. They did feel quite peripheral in 40k already. For the Thunderfire Cannon, they've already come out with the Fire Strike Servo Turret. I guess you maybe could proxy one as the autocannon version of those maybe. It'd still be perhaps slightly more anti-infantry, though it would be a direct fire weapon, not indirect, so a different feel there. Otherwise I guess it's the Legends rules. And for the Ironclad Hunter and Stalker, there's not really two great equivalents. Some of the Rhino chassis tanks could probably be made to work. Perhaps a Predator Destructor for the Stalker perhaps. The Ironclad I suppose you could run as a Blood Angels Furioso, or just a standard Dreadnought in some way. Definitely a bit more awkward to make the jump though. As well as just the actual units they've removed from the core codex as well, there could be some consequences for other more peripheral units, or things from the Divergent chapters as well. I think there's a pretty strong chance that the Bike Captain's datasheet could go away from this. The Bike Captain's datasheet is a Firstborn one, not a Primaris one, so it might be that the Bike Chaplain is literally the only model that you could use to lead Outrider squads after this. I think there'd be at least some concern for the Jump Pack Captain as well. Games Workshop still sell their upgrade pack of jump packs, but if there's not going to be any Firstborn captains on sale, then that might not save the datasheet. I think Dark Angels and White Scars armies are probably the biggest hits by this whole change. If the standard Biker Squad, Land Speeder and Attack Bike datasheets go away from all of these, they've lost a huge ton of useful options to their army, and they'd just be limited to the Storm Speeders, Invader ATVs and Outriders. I suspect that the Dark Angels Talon Master is probably going to be a knock-on casualty for this. That one just uses the standard Land Speeder kit, and then combines it with the Dark Angels upgrade kit for the Twin Assault Cannon, so when the Dark Angels Codex rolls around in spring there's a good chance that that's going to Legends. Looking at the web store, it still seems that the Raven Wing Bike Squad, basically a standard bike squad with some upgrade bits, is still on sale. Though I think at this point it's probably quite a questionable pickup if you want to buy more Firstborn bikes before the spring codex comes out. I feel like the Dark Angels one is probably odds on to get a fairly big range revamp similar to the Black Templars. It would make quite a lot of sense for them given that they've released the Lion, so interest in the Dark Angels is going to be far higher than normal. I suppose they might get some fancier kits for Outriders and things, or maybe upgrades for Storm Speeders. They certainly need something to add a bit of their flavour back into their Primaris models. Otherwise, for Space Wolves, they could have things like Wolf Scouts and Skyclaws affected. Again, kind of depends as to whether or not Games Workshop do come out with Primaris style Scouts and Assault Squads. Even if they do though, there's at least some chance that their unique datasheets could still suffer, and they might have these units just rolled back a bit more into the standard Space Marine Codex like happened with the Swift Claw bikes, where they don't really have much different options. For Blood Angels, it seems pretty likely that whenever they get their range updates, they'll probably get some new Primaris style Death Company and Sanguinary Guard. I feel like the Bile Predator and the Firstborn Scale Dreadnoughts are both at least kinda niche. If they're removing things like the Hunter, Stalker and Ironclad Dreadnought, seems like there'd be a very solid chance that they could also be on the chopping block, and you'd have to make do with things like Reaper Gladiators or Brutalis Dreadnoughts instead of the Furioso. I certainly would quite like to see things like some reimagined Death Company or Sanguinary Guard in Primaris scale. That would be really quite cool. But I feel like at the moment, for factions like Blood Angels and Dark Angels, I'd just be very apprehensive about picking up any of their Firstborn range if there's a good chance that a bunch of it could be sent to Legends or not really very directly playable. Coming back to the initial point of the video though, I feel like this slightly unexpected big Firstborn range removal is probably going to make more informed customers of theirs trust them a little bit less with any of the remaining Firstborn range, or at least if your aim is to have these supported for rules into the future and have them at the core of your 40k force. Despite having a really big chunk of their older kits go to Legends and out of production, there's still quite a lot left. Tactical squads and Devastator squads, Vanguard veterans, Centurions, the Venerable Dreadnought, and really quite a lot of tank classes. But I feel like to a lot of people, just Games Workshop showing that they're willing to just put a whole load of things into Legends when a next update goes out would make me very apprehensive to buy any of these right now. Unless of course you're just more of a painter and modeller and want the models for themselves, or happy to make do with some slightly jury-rigged or Legend rules going into the future. I think for a lot of people collecting Warhammer 40k in a slightly more mainstream way though, picking up a whole bunch of these just might not really be worth the risk. For newer players who just might not really care too much about the difference between Primaris and Firstborn and just think that Space Marines in general are cool, you're probably going to want to slant things towards the miniatures that aren't at the risk of having their models and rules invalidated or sent to Legends in the future. Seems like at least on paper it could create a bit of a death spiral with the Firstborn range. They say they'll stop supporting things when people stop buying them, but the fact that they're at risk from not being supported in the first place might just stop people buying them by its very nature. I'd at least guess though that anything that's printed in the upcoming Space Marine Codex will probably be good for a fair while into the future. Games Workshop only released the one Space Marine Codex in 9th edition, showing a bit more restraint than in previous editions of the game, though there's no 100% guarantee that it might not be different in 10th, and we could get a late 10th edition 2nd Space Marine Codex as we did in 8th. In any case, let me know your thoughts. How much of the Space Marine Rage culls affected your particular army? And has this recent cull made you any more wary of buying more Firstborn Marines when going forward with your collection? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.